いわ。相手になってあげる。
潰す。
オープンユアマジックサーキット。ファイト。そっちね。それ諦めなさい。逃がさない。さよなら。
シュ
このまだまだいい度胸ね。逃がさない。これはいけ。この飛べおまけ。ビンゴ。おっと下よ。邪魔。カウンター見える。いけ。飛べ猫返し。このそれおろさよなら。逃がさなきゃ。
軽い
やったべともらった。さよなら。気分はどう？期待外れ。ユーウィン。ターンユアマジックサーキット。ファイト。もろい。これは
シュー
まだ飛べ猫返し。諦めなさい。あちょっと飛んでけ。おまけ。この裏ね。このスタート。
行くぞ。
やったわね。そらマシュッター。このよっと
続け
ごちゃごちゃうるさい。したやつ
出直せ。
まだせーの。これでフィニッシュ。逃がさな。諦めなさい。逃がさな。さよなら。まだいい度胸ね。逃がさない。カウンターまだまだ。それもう怒った。そらこの飛べおまけ。逃がさない。飛べカウンターよっそこね。それ
もろい。
行く。気分はどう？逃がさない。気分はどう？なへえ、面白そう。
笑い話で済めばいいがな。
オープンユアマジックサーキット。ファイト。さよなら。
続けろ。
邪魔。そっちまい。まだまだ。それ。さよなら。やったね。カウンター甘く見てた。上よ。行くわ。カウンター気分はどう？行くわよ。行くわよ。気分はどう？逃がさない。行くわよ。まだまだ。カウンター気分はどう？逃がさない。逃がさない。カウンター
バサラモンだ。
行くわ。諦めなさい。諦めなさい。気分はどう？おまけ。まだやる？ユーウィン。ターンユアマジックサーキット。ファイト。せーの。カウンターやった。離れて。カウンターそら。これはここ。ほらほら。このおまけ。行くわよ。消えなさい。そら行くわ。カウンター諦めなさい。逃がせ。おまけ。潰れちゃ。行くわ。まだまだ。カウンターそう。カウンターこのおまけ。逃がさ上よ。フェイタル気分はどう？行くわよ。あちゃだ。カウンター
吹き飛べ。
KO。
まだ立つのか。難儀なことだ。
後悔しても知らないから。ファイト。さよなら。逃がさいい度胸ね。行くわよ。それよ。
シュー
まだ六
角未熟。
さよなら。
行くぞ。
カウンターまだまだ。カウンターいけ。この飛べおまけ。下よ。
弾く。
さよなら。上よ。カウンターいけ。猫返し。
聞いたか。
カウンター
さよなら。まだボンプに息を出ず。
消えなさい。あなたこの国の古い混血？人と混ざってはいるけど 血の質は厳重クラスよ。どうやって維持してたの？
Forever chasing settings. Good evening, everyone. Welcome finally to another Battle Lounge with the 2MK team. We are playing Melty Blood in our Tuesday Melt segment, which has started one entire match ago, but you couldn't hear my voice because settings. Today we're not actually talking about anything in particular though, so I decided to continue the stream without necessarily trying to solve the problem. Conceptually though, our plan for the day was to undertake standard training as if the enemy is a boss and that you have to figure out the pattern required to beat this boss. It's a fairly standard way to play against fighting game players and characters, but the more powerful the boss is, the more likely it is that you're going to have some sort of specific problem. That can be easily just tactical though. Today though, it looks like I am the boss somewhat. At least for one more round. A game like this that has a lot of different small adaptations you can make tends to be a little bit more fun in this mindset, because you're not just trying to react to or do the same thing exactly over and over. There is a spot at which you have to care. But the adaptation of your opponent can affect this in lots of ways. It's this constant bouncing back of understanding and adaptation that mostly makes these games interesting to people. And of course, why they're not interesting if you just can't even start, and your opponent just does a thing you can't deal with until they're destroyed. This is why it's so important that we fight people on our own level. But it's also super important to be able to even think about it clearly. This game is also one where, if you weren't very used to fighting games, you might find yourself with too many tools. And when you have too many tools, it's really tempting to basically do the equivalent of looking up a boss guide and figuring out which thing you're supposed to do based on that tool set. And there's basically nothing wrong with that. If you feel like doing it, do it. So whereas for me, that was actually fun because I know why all those interactions happened. To a beginner, that probably wouldn't have been. It's always possible, therefore, to just watch our streams to get the equivalent of that. Or to jump in to matches to try to learn it directly. as we aren't the type to try to overwhelm someone with just the same options over and over again, but we will often adapt to whatever option they're using. So if you feel as if your offense isn't good enough, or your awareness in battle isn't good enough, feel free to join us, simply because, win or lose, we'll probably help you work on it. This is also set to 3 consecutive wins before you are booted, which in this case means occasionally the boss changes. If they resurface by winning all of their matches, then they'll just continue to be in that spot. But there's always at least a break. Mash is a powerhouse with a lot of options in neutral, but they tend to lose because they're slightly slow, her air trickery isn't quite as good, and therefore she's kind of weak to sweep, particularly for characters who have good options out of sweep, where sweep in this case refers to 2C. Notice the spacing she continually puts herself at is relatively bad for other options. The wolf tends to play these characters with strong capacity to lock you down with their block strings to put you where they want you to be, but then you have to defeat them by breaking that somewhat. The level of oppressiveness that you have to deal with on defense when you don't just block can be kind of rough. But the easy way around this is to just default to sweep in every situation, literally all, until you learn which things don't work. Anything else you think will hit her is usually wrong, simply because the way her normals work tends to make it too difficult for whatever reason. Your opponent being forced to deal with the fact that you just hit the sweep is what you just saw. Through checking this, you can understand what necessities they have to face when this happens. Basically the start of a building block to what can I actually do here. Besides blocking, hitting sweep is basically your best option most of the time, simply because she doesn't have too many ways to just trick you. And most of her really good attacks start from her standing, as far as I've seen them. I really need to check more on that, but you never know. Now this is not to say that she will not adapt. The player will definitely find some way to make your life miserable. But note the tiny damage that it does so far, relatively. She doesn't have a good throw, she doesn't, well, in terms of following it up. She doesn't have a particularly threatening uppercut, and when she hits with her sweep, it really doesn't have too much payoff, because of the nature of the character. A lot of her moves either take so long to animate that they don't combo, or only go forward or up. The forward one, definitely useful, but the damage on it is again not great. Since her air defense is so good, you generally don't have as much to do. And you can see that eventually the opponent kind of just stops. They run out of options and have to retreat. If you're playing a long-range character, this is great. If you're playing a short-range character, it's much more difficult. But you can get enough advantage that way that you don't have to worry about it. If this was a game like Under Night, you'd get even more advantage because them retreating outright specifically causes them problems. But one good thing about Kouma in particular is that he can use so many options for advancing that also build meter, that he can just mess with people that way when they try to run too far. Mash in particular has a problem with this because she doesn't have a really good way to attack you from very, very far away as a whiff punish. So he can just do a lot of slightly armored approach options and so on when the time comes, and he'll resolve his problems. Once the Mash player has been forced to play the Sky game, you can move to even stronger forms of defense. But as you just saw, there's a lot of whiff punish capacity in just a long sweep. So if your character has one, that, especially one that combos into anything or gives them any main advantage, you care about this a lot in this matchup if your opponent is trying to pressure you at close range. And Kouma, as you can see, if you are build up even slightly effective combos, will generally be able to do this. She's relatively weak in the air against Kouma in a lot of situations because, as you can see, their moves just clash so much, and hers don't have the type of hitbox required to overwhelm Kouma's raw strength, more or less. The match becomes footsies, therefore, quite fast. But because Mash can't afford to commit as hard in footsies as Kouma can, I actually don't know what she's supposed to do there. So, if this continues, I guess we'll watch until we see. Some people solve this sort of problem by just doing more of a specific thing and hoping the opponent messes up. But that's not generally our method here, because it won't teach you enough. So for example, this whole sequence doesn't have a meaning. It's pressure, it's jump back stuff. It doesn't solve any of the problem that was being faced before. Master's jump is also sort of floaty, so even like Kouma just hitting sweep doesn't get punished if she went airborne. I feel like she has some moon moves that are supposed to solve this problem that actually do combo out of it, but Kouma could just do that sort of thing too. Right now, we're not seeing either character at full power for precisely that reason. And he has just enough reach to do this sort of ridiculous confirm, because she has a relatively larger hurtbox as a result of, you know, the giant shield. If he decides to just use more armor, this makes her life even harder, simply because he just goes through so many things and her hitboxes don't really help. So getting pushed back this way is really rough, but she probably has some options that I just don't know. The one thing that is true though is that the air one isn't, as far as I know, the main thing that actually works. Because she will run out of energy, and at that point, as the Kouma player, you're just watching to see whether or not her energy's gone. Once her energy's gone, you don't really have to care anymore. And at that point, just power through. It is this sort of interaction, this sort of built-up strategy within the match that makes us think of this as the boss fight or boss rush game. We actually see a lot of the similar things in this matchup, where, for the most part, charged sweep is a thing Kouma can just use, and with Roa's recent nerfs, this does tend to work out for a different reason. It's not specifically that it's to punish Roa when Roa is close, it's the neutral tool for when you're not sure if Roa is going to be attacking seriously or not, because you can't get in on him too easily the other way. But there's just enough charge on and clash frames on the 2C that Roa's main methods of zoning result in the same problem you saw before from Mash. It works, but it doesn't hurt. And works but doesn't hurt is like Kouma's happiest moment. The pushback on the move also helps quite a lot. And you get this result. Just being able to literally power through moves is kind of important. Your opponent will generally eventually just run away from it and make you quote-unquote waste the time. So you do have to, at that point, do the same thing again. Think, if you had a boss that you could force to run to the corner in a game, what would be the benefit of this? We see this a lot in the matchup between these two players, but often it has more to do with zoners that our Kouma needs to fight in this way. So it obviously doubles down once we've got Omni also playing zoner. Because Roa's throw doesn't lead to damage either, the same thing happens. Kouma can just go, yeah, you could dash at me and catch me out of this crouch C. But I don't care. And that was a large expenditure of energy because that was the counter. Because on the other side, it's Omni facing the boss that just armors up sometimes and has to be dealt with that way. So, if you think the boss is going to armor up, use the armor break. Kouma fortunately does enough damage on standard interactions, in fact nearly all of them, that you kinda stop caring after a while about whether or not it's going to happen. This puts our Roa on the extreme focus on whiff punishes phase, because neutral, in the sense that you'd expect it, is only winnable by relatively deep thinking on how to set up a whiff punish situation, not just, is an interaction happening? This leads to a lot of backdashing, which, interestingly, is one of the few things that Kouma doesn't immediately have a response for if the players, or rather the character's backdash is good enough. It's heavy commitment to deal with those that way. But Arcueid faces this situation in a lot of games against a lot of characters. When people rush to get away, particularly in long-range situations, it's likely that a lot of options are going to miss. And not even air dashing helps that much, but it is better than nothing, as the air dash tends to lead to, particularly empty air dash, to the opponent just whiffing stuff. It brings it down to the binary interaction of, are you going to watch for my air dash, therefore letting me do other stuff, or not? Basically all it's required. Even this isn't necessarily painful, forcing our Roa to eventually go on offense. And then we get to the point where these players are playing to their strengths. Because while Omni is not necessarily an offense-minded player, given the opportunity, the concept of offense tends to be practiced enough to not just immediately fail at it. The reason this often works has to do with the way resources are built up using these electrifying characters. With the rabbit having phases of, I have enough energy to do this, to be aggressive, and at some point I'm going to run out of energy. And if you can learn to tank through that phase of aggressive energy use, then it'll probably fall back to where it was before. This often means, in other games at least, that at the beginning of the round, one doesn't necessarily have to attack at all. Your opponent doesn't have enough energy to be aggressive successfully, so just hanging out might be fine. And we see a reset of the same situation. We're still even, but my opponent still has no energy. And wouldn't have necessarily built it up if I hadn't made that execution error, for example. It's a standard trade-off. Defense leads into offense through the amount of energy available to do one or the other. This is partially why we end up being so relatively even sometimes, simply because the instinct of when to attack and defend forces us both to improve in specific ways. And therefore we really get to play these sorts of games from just the perspective of, okay, am I executing well enough? No matter how much this looks like guessing, for example, when you see something happen that doesn't actually make whatever it looks like it's supposed to do, it's 90% of the time just some input error someone had somewhere. Given enough time and focus, neither of us tends to miss. Meaning that the more we play games, the easier it is to keep that up. See if this works. It worked. Unfortunately, as a result of that, the only thing I ever have to talk about in these matches is what I just said. We're both just aiming to improve pretty much physically as much as possible. Mistiming, misspacing, those are real things that we face, but they're usually a secondary aspect, a recovery from a scramble that happened because of a previous error in input. Because at nearly every point of the match, whatever could go wrong is probably being calculated. This, for example, well, no, in that case, now I've learned something, because as far as I thought, that was definitely not going to hit me, but it did. And now I've learned not to do that. But it's exactly the same sort of thing. Unfortunately, this doesn't usually help us as much in fights with stronger players, simply because this is one of those games that over time gets a little bit devolved. And that's kind of a problem. What I mean by that is simply that as you get better and better, the thing that's correct to do shifts so much to just one thing, that it's too difficult to use all of the other smaller tools and other weird interactions you've built up. Whereas, let's see, Guilty Gear, for example, and Street Fighter games tend to go the opposite way. You spend more and more time building up small skills that nearly never help, but help a lot when they do. And high-level play tends to be a lot of rotations between those things. Whereas here, knowing the perfect range at which one sweep will hit and one won't isn't very commonly seen. But this is probably just because of the way that the game retains, or in some cases does not retain, players they like. Top players have, in every game, dominated the scene simply because do you know how to stop them or not? What we really hope for most of the time is that the game will remain good enough for long enough that no one will mind this, and therefore that they'll have some time to build up some other options. But don't count on it. But it's not nothing. You can still stand up to high-level players using just the smaller tools that the game gives you. It's just it takes too long to do any damage. And even this isn't altogether a problem, because there are definitely scenarios in which the player you're dealing with doesn't have the same setups. Or they understand the game from the combo perspective, and that means they tend to mess up a specific aspect of it. So if you find yourself trying to figure out how to deal with this, think in much the same way you would if you were playing a boss in a single-player game. I'm not sure about everyone else, but in general, if I realize that the boss has two different attacks, one that hurts a lot and one that barely hurts at all, then I'm generally going to put myself in situations where the small one hits. In most games, you have some form of healing, and this is one of the few fighting games where you do get that healing just basically straight up. You can just use meter as if it's a potion. Particularly if you understand the spacings for doing that. You can also be quote-unquote interrupted out of your healing, or hurt while you're healing, but that doesn't really change the effectiveness of the concept in terms of planning. In fact, this does go the other way. For at least some Kouma matches, Our Aurora player takes the same approach. Not of, okay, I'm going to deal with this in general, but simply that without that sort of daring spacing and timing that certain Koumas use, it's too easy to just heal through his stuff. Because the way he does damage tends to be the type that you can heal up fairly easily if you manage to get enough meter to do it. And because he's not terribly good at reaching you if you've knocked him far enough away, you tend to get to heal basically for free. This is one of the main reasons it comes up, for example. When someone starts most of their combos with the quickest attack in the game, as you see here, the damage they actually end up doing is relatively pitiful for the amount of effort they put in. They're trying to set up a situation where you will lose because of crazy stuff happening right after, but you can just heal. You can just hit buttons to get out of that without having to think about it basically at all. The problem our Roa has is the general expectation, because I think Omni spends too much time playing high-level players, the general expectation that someone who is doing this sort of thing is doing it to make you do something different. But it's usually not the best option to do with that. Make them prove it, more or less. Just keep on thinking through, should I just go for heal here? And if so, make them prove it. Because spending all this energy and then not getting much out of it would just be kind of sad from their end too. But we do have the definite part where this still works. There's no real reason why the armor aspect of the match would ever stop working. That's what makes Kouma work in this matchup as a generality. But if your opponent's pressure is reliant on, okay, I'm going for 2A starters to make sure that I'm safe when I do it, you really don't care enough. That, on the other hand, did damage, like meaningful, real damage that you have to care about. They seem to be very similar, but one of them, as you remember, takes a massive amount of meter and effort to do something, and the other one doesn't. See? Scaling. But Aurora chose to use fully invincible, which is one that actually, if shielded, would likely cause an escape. And it didn't work out because there was not enough health left, more or less. But off they go. And soon, off we go. While the talking part of the stream did not start at the quote-unquote correct time, the stream itself did. And that means that we are going to probably be ending on this one. Mash is quite different in this case, because she has so many good moves that actually get to start, you know, real damage. But this is true for everyone. The important thing is actually more so the style of the player. The boss rush concept has more to do with the way the player chooses to aim their damage than it does to mostly the character. You can avoid ways for people to actually manage to damage you, but if someone is immediately starting with weak damage options, you probably don't have to fear them in the same way very much. Since at that point all you care about is, can I get this person off me and force them to have to do that again? And in the end, there's always a way, because if they were not willing to hit it every time more or less, and therefore be countered by those options, then what are you complaining about? Part of this comes up usually because the player is trying not to be outsmarted. But this is a common thing in fighting games as a generality. If you're trying not to be outsmarted, the player who plays in the most straightforward, least thinking way possible will beat you. We have multiple memes on the subject. Are we in a macking room or is it just lagging? Either way, I guess I can also end it here if it is in fact stuck. It's not stuck. Let's go. Unfortunately, this is something that bots can't teach you well. At least, not if you're not the type to already think about it or listen to me talk about it for multiple streams across multiple games. But we have some where we have specifically tried to make it so that the player can think about different ways in which they're taking big damage versus small damage. So you can try something from there at least. You can find our bots for this game, which are usually not too difficult to input, on our website 2-mk.org. We don't have many of them because we were definitely waiting for big changes to the game's mechanics, and it was basically worth waiting. As long as it took, they ended up changing exactly the sorts of things we expected to need to be changed, and those sorts of things are the things that would change the entire way that we build bots to teach people different things beyond what the beginner-ish ones that we have on site already teach. So, we are planning to start working on these ones again, and of course, as you can see, collecting a lot more data than we were before. At least part of our lower tendency / hesitation to play this game was related to the fact that we knew they were going to change it. We knew they were going to fix things and unfix some things depending on what you enjoy. But not necessarily sure that we're having that this week. You can check out our Twitter 2_MK_FGC at 7:30 Eastern on nearly any day to figure out if we're streaming, and on Friday in particular to find out if we are streaming this guidance for any bots we do develop. But that brings us to the end of this stream. This has been Rillian for Team 2MK. Good luck with your training. Good night, everyone.